Hi, everyone. Welcome to your podcast, New Books in Economic and Business History. I'm your host, Javier Mejia from Stanford University. And today I have the great pleasure to be with Anna Grzymala-Busse. She's a professor at the Department of Political Science here at Stanford, where she's also the director of the Europe Center and a senior fellow at the Freeman Spalding Institute for International Studies. She's the author of Sacred Foundations: The Religious and Medieval Roots of the European State, a book that was just published by Princeton University Press. We're going to be talking today with her about the book and about her career. Hi, Anna. How are you?
Hi, fine, thank you. Thank you for having me.
I'm very happy to have you here. The first time that I met you, you were in sabbatical there at CAPS up there in the hills at Stanford, and you were precisely working on this manuscript. And so I'm very happy to see the final outcome in a very tangible way.
It's all about material culture, isn't it?
Right. Let me ask. So before getting to the book, I would like to hear a bit about your career. Why don't you tell us a bit about who you are, where are you from, how did you end up being interested in political science, and then where the interest for medieval history emerged. Tell us a bit about you, please.
Sure. My parents and I immigrated from Poland to the United States when I was 10 years old. And I spent my formative years in Kansas, where my father was a professor at the University of Kansas, and then moved to the East Coast for college. And took these fantastic classes from amazing history professors, especially medieval history professors. But like so many other people, I thought I was going to go into law school, and so I took the LSAT. And a week later, realized that that's the last thing I want to do with my life. And instead, this rapid turnaround and applied for grad schools. Um, and because I'm from Poland, initially my work was very much focusing on sort of the post-communist developments, on how communist successor parties remade themselves into good Democrats, how the post-communist state was built, and how Democratic Party competition influenced that formation. But then I turned sort of more broadly to religion because I guess you can take the girl out of the Catholic Church, but the converse doesn't hold. And so I wrote a book about religious influence on contemporary politics and the ways that it was grounded in sort of the formation of national identities and their relationship to the church. And then decided to go back even further historically and take a look at the role of the Catholic Church in the sort of initial formation of state institutions in medieval Europe. And this is where those classes that I took in college from these fantastic professors really sort of came back all these years later and largely informed how I went about doing the study.
So how was your or I'm thinking here that my interaction with historians is not always the easiest one. I feel that sometimes they look at you with some sort of suspicious or of us some kind. Um, but how was your experience? Like specifically going into medieval studies, right? Which is a community fairly small of people that are very focused on sources, and they're a very specific type of people. How do you feel? Like, do you interact at all with them? How was the experience of getting into those fields?
I think I would say two things. One is that you're right. Historians do view social scientists very skeptically. I think they view the idea of broad generalizations as being almost offensive to their craft, which is all about context and nuance and sort of crafting an argument through sort of very specific pieces of evidence assembled very intricately. Um, but on the other hand, I think there's sort of a great deal of sympathy, partly because so many social scientists have been traversing this territory. There are a lot of economic historians like David Cantoni, Noam Newman, Van Zanden, Buring, Bosker, these fantastic scholars who've been examining historical, Mark Dincheko, who've been examining historical data that goes back to, in some cases, the 10th century and even earlier, and have been using it to construct social scientific arguments. So I think given this kind of turn in historical political economy and given the sort of readiness with which social science now uses historical data, I think we're building bridges, willy-nilly, even if I think, what we would consider explanations, historians would consider sort of, unfair teleology. Um, but I think that's still something to it's an interesting time to be a social scientist interested in history. I would put it that way.
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, your comments make me think about how this is going to evolve over time. That if eventually we're going to become an independent type of discipline or something where historians and political scientists and economists can live happily. But I want to start to begin our conversation on the book. And before getting into the main argument that you explore, um, one of the what I feel is one of the aims of the book is to bring the conversation of state formation in Europe earlier in time, right? So, what it seems to be the dominant approach is one that points out to early modern period when trying to understand the origins of the European or the modern state. And a good part of what you do in the book is trying to say, like, hey, this is much more antique, and it can take place in the early medieval period. And before again hearing about the arguments for that, I would like to hear what made you think that that was the case. What did you feel that was missing in that literature that
Right.
require a proper response and spending years writing this book?
That's a loaded question. I think the idea that emerges from a lot of the literature on sort of Bellicist approach to state formation, whether it's all of which locate state formation in the early modern period, whether it's Tilly, Downing, Anderson, Ertmann, there's a general sort of sense that, especially in Tilly, that institutions of taxation and parliament sort of emerge as functional responses to very expensive early modern warfare. And in this story, and this is something that also, North and Weingast take up, basically what happens is that you have this very expensive early modern warfare that necessitates some kind of a bargaining over resources between the king and the nobles. And as a result, we have these bargains struck that basically, on one hand, engender parliaments, on the other hand, increase the possibility for the king to get revenue through taxation. But we know for a fact that both taxation and parliaments, A, precede the early modern era. They were around in the 1200s. And B, if this really were the case, then we wouldn't see so many absolutist regimes, right, that didn't rely on parliaments emerge out of the early modern period. So I think there was a sort of a frustration with what seemed to be an incompleteness of at least sort of, the canonical story that were being told in grad school. And that sort of led me to explore, well, where did these institutions actually come from? And it turns out that both historians and others have written quite a bit about the ways in which these institutions arose much earlier, and they arose not out of as functional responses to the needs of warfare, but as as both sort of as templates from the church and as sort of counsels for the king himself.
So your story is one that has two main characters. On the one hand, you have the Catholic Church, and then on the other one, you have the secular rulers, right?
Right.
Um, you don't try to do a comparative work in the sense of you're not comparing Europe with East Asia or something like that, but it seems that Europe has this very specific particularities in terms of the interaction of these two characters. What were those interactions and or those particularities, right? So
Right.
one of them seems that it's the fairly early independence between those two powers. Can you say a bit about that? What's this essence that seems to be different between Europe and other processes of state formation in the world?
Right. So I think the first thing to note, and I think the first thing that scholars have noted, is that whereas you see large centralized empires, both in China and in the Middle East, in Europe you have an incredibly fragmented landscape of kingdoms, principalities, duchies, bishoprics, all of whom are vying for power. And there's basically no single actor that establishes that kind of hegemonic control that you see, for example, in China. And so that's already, I think, a big difference. And this was sort of taken as basically just a given, so some kind of an exogenous condition that occurred after the collapse of the Roman Empire. But one of the things that I argue in this book is that it's actually quite deliberate. And it's deliberate because the Catholic Church was actually under the thumb of what becomes known as the Holy Roman Empire. Secular rulers would name the popes, they would name bishops, who were incredibly important because they were both royal administrators and spiritual emissaries of the Pope. And in many ways, these secular rulers would control the church. And it's only in the 11th century that the church, basically the papacy, Pope Gregory VII to be exact, begins this process of both centralizing the church within and of really asserting autonomy from without. And once that process gets underway, the papacy gains enormous amounts of power, largely because it has so much wealth and so much human capital and has an organizational reach that no other ruler can have. And as it does so, one of the first things that it does is to try and keep Europe fragmented, right? It doesn't want a large hegemon that would basically act as a counterweight to the papacy, a large hegemon that could basically hold the papacy and the church under its thumb. And so it goes after the Holy Roman Empire. It really fragments that entire area. The Holy Roman Empire doesn't become a single state until basically the 19th century as a result. And so that fragmentation, which is seen as so sort of characteristic of Europe and seen as so unique to Europe, is directly the outcome of this conflict between the church and secular rulers. There are other ways in which Europe is seen as unique. So, for example, the idea of institutions like parliaments, which are assemblies that express both consent and representation, is again unique to Europe. But as I argue in the book, that owes a lot to religious or to church concepts of representation and of sort of binding powers. We also see independent autonomous universities in Europe, almost alone among the other continents. They're not owned by the state. They're not run by the state. And those universities basically arise largely because of the rediscovery of law that the church participates in. And you have this phenomenon where popes and emperors sort of race to charter universities. And so the story of human capital in Europe and the preponderance of universities in the rule of law, again, has a lot to do with sort of the imitation of these earlier church templates and with the kind of rivalry between the church and state in an attempt to basically assert church autonomy.
I want to ask you a bit more about that rivalry between church and the secular powers. What were the tools that were used by the church to fight that war? Right, like how did
Right.
the Pope maintain or try to keep Europe fragmented?
So the church basically relies on three different kinds of weapons. Um, the first of these are purely spiritual weapons. And these are excommunications and interdicts. And it turns out those actually don't work so well. So, the record holder is the Holy Roman Emperor Henry IV, who gets excommunicated 5 times by 3 different popes. But it doesn't prevent him from basically governing for decades and, being an incredibly successful emperor. So the popes very quickly find out that excommunications or sort of, placing an entire community under interdict simply isn't very effective. So they turn to basically sort of classic secular weapons. They very rarely lead armies themselves. When they do, it almost inevitably ends in disaster in the medieval period. But what they do instead is to build all kinds of alliances and coalitions. And they basically fund wars by proxy, and they fund the depositions of rulers by allied secular kings and princes. So in effect, they basically sort of act as sort of funders and puppet masters for a whole bunch of sort of rulers who are already vying for power with the Holy Roman Empire or with France or with whatever sort of region the Pope seems to favor at the time. And the third set of weapons that work quite well are political crusades. So we think of a crusade as this expedition to the far off east, as a way of regaining Jerusalem and bringing back Edessa under the fold. But in fact, the modal crusade is a political one, and it's launched against a ruler within Europe that the Pope finds to be disloyal or wayward or somehow, not loyal enough to the Pope. And so these are the three kinds of weapons, the sort of the spiritual ones that don't work so well, the coalitions and alliances that work very well, and the papal crusades. And I'm actually collecting a huge data set right now of all the crusades and the role that the popes, and sort of the roles that the popes played in basically overturning rulers through the Crusades.
I'm a bit curious about that, and in general, in the way you speak and you talk about the church and in your book. It feels like a very effective type of organization, one that seems to work fairly well on the inside, and also one that, on the one hand, had much more human capital, and not only that,
Mhm.
probably more even social capital. Maybe that's not probably the way in which you frame it, but it seems to be well connected both with the masses and also with rulers and elites, right? Um, how do you think about that? What were the sources of success of the church as an organization? What kept the effectiveness and those like valuable assets that some were
Right.
tangible in terms of like just wealth, but some of them were these things that are not obvious that were valuable and that were possible to maintain over time.
Right. So, I think the first thing I would say is that the church was a very effective organization, relatively speaking. Right. So, this is a time where we can't really speak about anything resembling a modern state. There are no impersonal bureaucracies. There are no clearly defined boundaries. There's a lot of internal competition for authority. And so, relative to that, the church seems a pretty effective organization. And it's effective partly because of these reforms that Gregory VII introduces in the 11th century that are designed to really sort of impose a hierarchy within the church, sort of purge it of basically all kinds of sort of ancillary or basically rent-seeking behavior, um, to ensure that the church functions as an effective organization that can deploy both its wealth and its human capital sort of effectively and consistently. So I think the wealth certainly helps, the human capital certainly helps, but there's also an enormous amount of spiritual authority. Right? I mean, medieval life is suffused with religion. The idea of being an atheist or of not believing in God is just, it's beyond the sort of comprehension of, I think, many people at the time. You have a lot of sort of concern in the 12th century of heretics and sort of, keeping their religion pure. And all that has to do with the fact that the church has this enormous spiritual authority within Europe. It is the one organization that can promise eternal salvation, right? No ruler, no matter how ambitious or how powerful, would ever make that claim. But the Pope and the Church can make that claim that the way to eternal salvation is through the Church, um, and that gives the Church enormous spiritual authority. It doesn't mean that it's always listened to. There are plenty of things on which the Church is totally ignored. Um, there's lots of evidence that anti-usury laws are ignored, that laws against, extramarital sex are ignored, even the church's preference for electing kings. All of that gets ignored widely. I mean, human beings are human beings, but nonetheless, the church can really reach out to the masses, both with its organizational presence. There's a bishopric and a cathedral and a monastery nearly everywhere, and with the spiritual authority that makes it sort of the unique source of salvation in Europe.
So we talked about a bit ago about this rivalry between the church and the kings, and that was an important force. But you also have described a force that was related to emulation and probably
Mhm.
cooperation. What did that look like? I want to ask you at some point when you mentioned crusades. I went back to think about the classical crusades to the Near East, and it
Right.
always they are always described as this cooperative effort in
That's
which
right.
the main signal was basically the guide of the Pope. And so I want to ask you a bit about that. What was the figure of the church as a coordinator among secular rulers?
So some of the key characteristics of the crusade are that it gets called by the Pope, and that the participants are offered so-called crusader privileges. So in effect, basically, they're sort of told that all kinds of indulgences, all kinds of promise of spiritual benefit for participating in the crusade. And the Pope then relies on secular rulers to bring together the men and the resources, the supply wagons, to coordinate all the logistics. So only the Pope can call a crusade. And once called, those crusades will offer all kinds of privileges to the crusaders. But it's exactly as you say, there's an enormous amount of coordination involved with the secular rulers. And there's, the historical record is littered with historical rulers who don't live up to their promises of either funding or people, or of rulers that decide to go off on a crusade by themselves. The sacking of Constantinople. I mean, all these things that the Pope definitely would not want to see happen. So there's not only just coordination, but there's also a massive principal agent problem where, the Pope can basically ask these rulers, and the rulers will agree to go on a crusade, but he has very little way of controlling what they do once they actually set off, right? And so you have all these incidents of basically massive rent seeking and shirking behavior left, right, and center, and the Pope can't do anything about it. But it is, at least initially, very much a coordination where the Pope promises the Calls Crusade, he coordinates, he promises these spiritual benefits, and the rulers respond and gather the forces and the materials necessary for the crusade.
So one, I'm thinking still about this. Um, which I don't know, like, I mean, like the cooperation, that's something that I find very interesting about your argument, that there's this um intertwined interaction between cooperation and competition.
Hmm.
And now I'm thinking about the adoption of practices that were common among the church by secular rulers. And one of the things you mentioned is the adoption of law and decision making rules within secular environments. Can you say a bit about that, please?
Sure. So again, given the church's relative organizational advantages, it and its spiritual authority, it offers some attractive templates for how to run things. And we can divide these into three different categories. There are literally administrative templates where the division of labor in the papal courts and the way of doing things in the papal court gets imitated by secular rulers. And a lot of the times this has to do with the fact that you have bishops who act both as the Pope's emissaries, but who also act as royal administrators. So until the 16th century, right, the royal chancellor in England, for example, is a Catholic bishop. Always. That's just who he always is. So there's an enormous amount of staffing with high-ranking clergy, and they basically act as conduits for document templates, for how to write a petition, for how to organize your finances, making sure that you have inputs, outputs, and auditing procedures, all of which are imported directly from the papal curia. So there's that kind of direct emulation. When it comes to law and parliaments, there's and even I think more interesting story to be told. So during this conflict between Gregory VII and Henry IV, this initial conflict between this newly ascended papacy and the Holy Roman Empire, what you have basically is the rediscovery of Roman law. So there are these codices that have been around for a while. They get rediscovered in a monastery, and very quickly they get systematized and put forth. And law, two things follow. One is that law starts being used as a weapon. So rather than fighting a battle, you see popes and emperors both argue using legal arguments, right? The Pope uses all kinds of legal arguments to assert his authority and to downplay imperial authority over other rulers. And in this way, basically, you also have the systematization of canon law as well, church law, roughly 70 years later. And the two are basically constantly being used in courts, in statute making, in legal decisions. So they become intertwined to the point that Roman law and canon law form the key core of current European civil law. Those are the two key aspects of it and it's almost impossible in some cases to figure out what comes from what, because the church uses Roman law and secular courts use canon law, willy-nilly. So that's one thing that happens. The other thing that happens is that because the law is seen as such an attractive way to adjudicate disputes, it's a lot cheaper, it's a lot less bloody, it's a lot, and frankly, it's a lot more decisive, right? A legal decision binds in ways that a one battle may not. Both secular and religious authorities start to really race to have more legal experts, to have that legal expertise. And so what do? They basically help along universities. The first university in the in Europe, in Bologna, it was founded in 1088 during the height of this conflict, and was founded as a law school. And so that kind of proliferation of law schools all over Europe basically allows both church and secular rulers to get these legal experts. And it really leads them to sort of charter universities. So it's not that they own the universities, they don't run the universities, but they offer all kinds of privileges and protection for university students and university professors. Um, and so they basically start to compete because if you charter the university, then you get the first pick of the experts that come from it. So the story of law is a really fascinating one where you have sort of this relatively closely spaced discovery of both canon and civil law and their systematization, the intertwining of these two corpuses of law to form European civil law. And at the same time, this sort of a huge proliferation of human capital by founding the law schools, by chartering them, and by relying on those legal experts. And this, by the way, is how the church eventually becomes obsolete, right? Because once you have all these legal experts that have been trained in the law schools, you no longer need clergy and bishops nearly as much as you used to, right? They no longer need to be the judges. You have your own secular experts that can serve as judges. So that, I think, is sort of a fantastic story of how both sort of, secular and religious concepts of law intertwined to produce what we now think of as rule of law in Europe. And the story of parliaments is, also an interesting one because the whole idea of that, if there's taxation, then those who will be taxed have to express their consent to taxation. That idea is taken directly from church councils. The idea of proctorial representation, where a town or an area can send a representative, and that representative can make binding decisions on behalf of the community. That's also taken directly from church councils because they basically wanted to have clergy come to the councils, but couldn't, of course, host everyone. So they basically would elect representatives. And finally, even the concept of majority rules rather than consent is a church invention. And all of these basically then flow directly from church councils to nascent parliaments, and they flow through the bishops. The bishops in nearly all the countries in Europe have representation in the parliament, and there they insist that the same rule that taxation requires consent be applied in secular parliaments as well. And so this is a clear example of both sort of conceptual borrowing and sort of personal insistence on these rules being enforced. It comes directly from the church.
I think it's fascinating, all like that part of your argument, because for someone that does economic history, we're so focused on modernity as well, and human capital accumulation, institutional innovation also seems to be something of the modern world. And you
Mhm.
describe like quite extensively how it was not exactly the case, right? So it feels also like a rediscovery of probably different foundations at an economic level, and I love like
Yeah.
that element in the book. Um, but
So
I
here,
want to ask you, yeah, go ahead, please.
no, I just wanted to mention something. I think there's a huge focus on the culture of growth, and the sort of the Shapley hypothesis, and and Joel Moker's work and Deirdre McCloskey's work on this sort of culture of innovation and of sort of discovery and this sort of celebration of human capital in a way. Um, and what's ironic is that this is sort of attributed to both the early modern period and in some versions of this thesis to Protestants, right, and to their
Mhm.
individualism, their sort of competitiveness, their sort of different, very different, unmediated relationship to God. But we see all these things already there on the ground in the 12th century and 11th century in medieval Europe. Again, sort of, this enormous sort of ferment, this intellectual ferment in the 12th century, and the rediscovery of Aristotle in the 13th, leads basically to this enormous flowering of sort of a culture of inquiry and of research and disputation, all of which predates the early modern period by 400 years. And so the Catholic Church is actually sort of, in this version of the argument, right, actually is more favorably, it's not, the Catholic Church isn't opposed, but in fact, it's very sort of favorably situated to support, the growth of human capital inquiry, research, scientific arguments, and so on.
Now that you mentioned the Reformation and Protestantism, how does that fit into your story? It arrives later, but in a certain way, it's like a direct competition for these spiritual prerogatives
Right.
that the church had. What's the story there?
So, the Reformation basically is kind of the final nail in the coffin because church influence has already really decreased in the 15th century and the 16th century. The church basically overreaches. And so repeatedly popes overreach. They use their power poorly. The church itself is forced into, Avignon, into basically what's known as the Babylonian captivity. And after that, there's a split within the church where there's both a Roman and an Avignon papacy. And with that split, the Great Schism, you basically see an enormous loss of church power and influence within Europe. And that already is happening in the 14th and early 15th century. So the Reformation, when it takes off, has an interesting relationship to this earlier story of church influence in two ways. One is that it takes off in the Holy Roman Empire, precisely the area where the church was most successful in fragmenting authority. So initially, Luther is protected by his prince, by Frederick, against the emperor, Charles V, who's very much a Catholic. And were it not for the church's earlier success in fragmenting the Holy Roman Empire, the Reformation could not have taken off the way it did. But it did because there are all these small principalities that would protect Protestants against the demands of the Catholic Church to do away with them. So one, the Protestant Reformation really ironically takes off in precisely the lands where the church was earlier was much more successful in fragmenting authority. Secondly, the church responds too late to to the Reformation of the Council of Trent. And it responds so late because it's worried that basically, its own sort of propagation of representation and councils has led to something called conciliarism within the church, which is the idea that councils and assemblies basically trump popes and rulers. And they're worried that if they hold a council that somehow would address the Reformation directly, these people who prize and give primacy to councils would basically run roughshod over the popes. And so its own earlier innovations and its own earlier successes stymie the church's response to the Reformation. And the Reformation largely takes off as successfully as it does because the church is unable to respond to it given these earlier successes, both in promoting fragmentation and in promoting kind of conciliar thinking within its ranks.
Let me ask you one question related, I guess, to like the big picture of your argument, and this comes from I guess my own interest in like the Latin world, right? And most of your the core of your argument takes place in like the Germanic world,
Right.
right? How do these other places in Europe fit into your story, right? I guess that, well, a good part
Right.
of the Iberian Peninsula was under Muslim control, but
Mhm.
what was happening in France, in, well, northern Spain, are they just like outliers? Are they interacted and part of in a peripheral way of the story, or is it just the same part of the story, and we're just not we have just like softer type of evidence?
So I think they're very much part of the story, and the empirical evidence in the book, controls for the Holy Roman Empire, but it encompasses all of Europe. So we basically have all of Europe divided into 100 by 100 kilometer grid cells from 900 to 1850, with of course huge missing data problems. But these conclusions basically apply to all of Europe. But the story of Spain, for example, is absolutely fascinating because the popes endow, relatively late in the game, endow the Reconquista with crusade privileges, right? And they basically empower Christian rulers to sort of start pushing out the Muslim rulers of Spain, in the name of the church as well. And the fascinating story there is of how those rulers, especially by the time of Ferdinand and Isabella, actually gain enormous power within. Spain is relatively centralized by European standards. And those rulers
Mhm.
gain so much power that they're able to then start exacting concessions from the papacy and basically saying, actually, we want to continue to name our own bishops. And actually, because we're so important to the survival of Catholicism, we need all kinds of concessions from the papacy regarding taxes, and the publication of papal decrees in Spain, and so on. And so it's this sort of fantastic story of all these sort of human capital and institutional resources that flow to Spain that are then used to enormously strengthen the Spanish monarchs against the church. And so by the 15th century, by the late 15th, early 16th century, you have sort of Spanish monarchs taking over the Inquisition, for example. This story that we're told is that the Inquisition is this sort of church run amok in Spain, but in fact it's controlled by the secular monarchs, right? It's basically what the church will only do what the secular monarchs will allow it to do, and they hand over the victims if they're executed back to the secular state. And so they have far less power than we would have thought previously, given the fact that the monarchs actually exert a considerable control over the church and over the Inquisition by the 16th century.
That's a fascinating feature of your story, that it has this sort of tragic element out of it. The
Yeah,
church is like pushing so hard to keep their power, and precisely in that process, by the end of the day, it's actually losing its relevance.
yeah,
And that
no,
it's I
it's a
think that's
familiar
lovely
story,
part.
right? You hand over all these resources. It's kind of, I think any parent of a teenager would identify with this, because you hand over all these resources and advice, and the sort of, the secular state takes it, but then grows resentful about it, and so asserts independence, which in many ways is exactly as it should be. It certainly benefits Europe to have a very independent set of secular rulers, but it doesn't do away with the sort of church influence earlier on and the kind of enormous shaping that it did of church institutions.
That's a pretty good analogy, and I would like to get back to, I guess, the beginning of our conversation, but to expand a bit in that direction. So, in terms of what are like the big lessons of your story and your book, and I would like to hear about your thoughts as someone who knows very well the contemporary influence of religion and political outcomes. How do you think that these historical roots of the emergence of the state and the influence of religion are insightful to think about the role of religion now? So I'm thinking, for instance, about your expertise in the Soviet bloc, and how important it
Mhm.
was, the prohibition of religion at some point as part of the communist project, um, which eventually probably was not as successful in the very long term. And maybe it's because precisely there are these very, very profound roots that are there. How do you think about all these things from a contemporary perspective?
Right. So I don't. Excuse me. The book doesn't argue that we see evidence of some direct influence of the medieval church on contemporary politics. I think I would view this much more as a stage setting, right? So a lot of the sort of familiar institutions, whether direct taxation or parliamentary representation or European civil law, were fundamentally shaped by this earlier medieval church influence. But you have massive border changes, you have massive population shifts, you have several huge wars that totally transform Europe, whether the 40 Years' War or World War One or World War Two, right? In ways that sort of basically in many cases create rubble out of what used to be this institutional landscape. But what I do see the influences, I think the sort of the big takeaway that I draw from this is that the most secular of institutions can have religious roots. And what matters is sort of making sure that the religious arguments don't carry primacy in those institutions. But they can nonetheless, religious institutions can nonetheless sort of, or sorry, secular institutions can have these very religious roots. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. They can be fully functional despite having roots that are not necessarily democracy promoting, or in fact might be antithetical to democracy. So I think the first big takeaway is that sort of the most secular of institutions can have religious roots. And so we ought to be very careful about sort of, casting aspersions on religion and religious authorities, because they might be more helpful in institutional creation than we might think. I think the second big lesson is to sort of, European state formation is taken almost as a truism, right? We all learn Tilly in grad school or come across him as undergrads. We all think this is a canonical story of state formation. And so many scholars have found it wanting in Latin America, in Asia, in Africa, where basically the story doesn't fit. And it turns out that the story doesn't really fit in Europe either. So maybe before sort of, exporting these truisms to other places and being surprised that doesn't fit, we ought to sort of figure out first whether in this canonical case of state formation in Europe, the truisms ever held in the first place. Um, and I think the third sort of big takeaway is that, related to that, is that state formation is incredibly complicated. And it's not just sort of, it's not reducible to just war or just contracts. It's going to look very different in different places. It's going to involve multiple forces and their interaction. And in some cases, it's going to involve this kind of imposition from above. In others, it's going to be sort of, organic bottom-up solutions. There's the impact of colonialism and of natural resources. And so we ought to be very careful about any kind of a monocausal explanation of state formation, either in the modern era or historically.
I'm very glad that we're finishing on that note about bringing back complexity in an environment that appreciates so much unicausal, fancy, and sexy stories. So I'm very
Right,
glad
right.
that your book captures that so well. Well, it was very fun talking to you. Thanks a lot for writing such a fascinating book, for taking time to talk to us. I hope to see you soon, Anna.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. This is a real pleasure. And see you soon on campus.